So we spoke a bit on what I've deemed the pathfinder and how one uses this mapping system. And the mapping system that was expressed in an existential way can be better defined and more complexly, or as I use the term doxastically, where we're combining symbols, symbolism, mathematics, and logic, doxastic logic, right? Where we're really looking at this and we're taking the symbols seriously as a proto-existent way of keeping track of circumnavigation of a complex travel that became, in the prior video, a existential reading of topographical information. But what it really represents, or re-represents, is this re-representation of an internal existent state and travel within the mind, and how the organs of our bodies, particularly when we look at the brain and we see the neuroplasticity, if you look at it more like from an epigenetic sense, and say that, use the term form follows function, function into form, something that renders an architectural awareness that also utilizes the strong and weak nuclear forces, and even to some extent gravity itself, shapes us, right? But that our effort always, as the pathfinder, is to find our way home, is to begin with the monad. And the generic interpretation of this is one of the womb, birth, in this singular lifetime, not really taking into account the formative aspects, a carrying of the torch, so to speak, that we are trying to break free from the cellular division, the disparate compartmentalization of this prisoner's outlook. In other words, we're trying to use everything in our ability, and the only thing that we truly recognize is that we come to these 9 layers of the human body, we come to this inevitable place or zone where both the glandular system and the nervous system stand at the ready, stand at the gates to make sure that we don't break beyond a certain geometrical construct that is meant to house us and to do exactly that, acting almost like a plank wall, or the infinitesimal smaller division of an inescapable mechanism, so that we will remain a certain shape, so that we will remain in a certain corral posture control, so that we are conned by the existential into believing that we are limited to almost thinking about it in a more two-dimensional rationalistic scope. But when we begin to think more doxastically, and then inevitably epistemologically and ontologically, as we start to piece this together and say, look, we live in a sense in a multifarious zone, right, of jurisdictional powers, and that is when we begin to look at the shapes. We take geomantria, I gotta get something to drink, and other symbols that reoccur throughout time immemorial, throughout history, around the world, in this reoccurring thematic presentation that really states what, like, there's, from an existential sense, it's like, what do you have to show to me of your value, world? And the world tries to echo back and refract first, actually, by putting you on notice, by challenging the individual by saying, well, what do you have to offer the existential, right? And the two couldn't be more contrary, antithetical, and in any more of an oppositional defiant role, played against one another. So what we begin to see is that this manifestation taking place, where we begin to battle with ourselves with a modified sense of freedom through principle and personal principle application. A lot of what Aristotle, and in that respect, Plato and Socrates represented, and then carried that torch all the way down through Alexander the Great. Some may even throw Marcus Aurelius' meditations in with this, right? A more stoic reserve, right? I'll accept things as they are, but I will do my very best and excel with whatever life throws at me, the ontological. But as we see, there's something very unnatural about nature, as I say. So that brings us back around to the number system, and how the numbers have really been, we talked about the Gaelic oral traditions. We talked a little bit about, on the other side of the spectrum, runes. We made a correction there. And then we also discussed in the prior video these reoccurring 30+ symbols that are documented and seen around the world. So of course we find this in a dogmatic sense, implied not just through the geomatria and the utilization of alphabet and number systems, but we see that this amalgamation, this abbreviation, sort of a shorthand, can be noted and seen in the very number systems and how they identify energy pathways within our own bodies, right? And the phenomenon that takes place there. So that you can actually have a rational mathematics, esoteric mathematics, but even to go to the extent, as silly as it might seem, is where you have erotic number systems, where you reach this doxastic truth and you begin to see how the symbol 100% identifies itself through the promulgation of this on this sexual basis that does not state just mere procreation. It does not merely just state the continuance of the generation of life. It talks about another world. And again, we get into the doxastic aspect of this, but then we get into the esoteric, the unavoidable esoterics of mathematics, the arcane, where you see this duality emerge, right? And you see this fight back to the purity of the monad. And this is what John Dee was working on, and this is what the world, through crypto cipher code, really non-Euclidean spherical mathematic components that computer systems run off of, i.e., minus, plus, zero. When we see these zeros and ones emerge, and this principal argument that takes place with the number systems themselves that infused in this right and left paradigm, or is it up and down, right? We begin to see how this takes place in the quantum field with fermion and the behavior of this sort of dilating principle of ever larger and smaller components that merely replicate this bi or dipolarity, right, in action, and reintroduce a notional aspect on yet another quadrant or zone or layer of reality with the same argument over and over again. In other words, we're always under the discourse. We're always tucked under the bridge, under the dialogue of some sort of moral agent, right? So, we always either feel like we are criminals in process of getting away with a crime, or that we are the persecuted, right? And both are happening. And this is really well represented in the whole concept of Plato's cave, right? But what we esteem in this day and age is that we can actually break free from this, right? And it's alarming how similar the formation or the formulation, the emergent mind, the new religion that's the same old religion, but as people hash out and graph back together the amalgamated chimera of the human expression, right? What we begin to see is that human expression is one of a very Gnostic nature, right? So we start to look at terminologies, valuations, a word usage, a principle-based pecking order as to a nexus or a core or a center to all of these principles, and an evolution or a generation or a rotation, right? Where these principles become inevitable, that there in fact is an epistemological system, despite how that may let Nietzsche down, right? Because his supposed hatred of systems. But I think that he really dislikes systems for a specific purpose, because it shows that Konrad Zuse that I talk about, Alan Turing, even Jacobo Greenberg, that there really is a system in play, and that there is more than an inference, that there is an on-running computational subset going on here, i.e. A deterministic, Robert Sapolsky, right, deterministic program that's on-running, but that this free will really gets into deviant number systems, where one is boxed into a certain behavioral pattern, where you begin to see this idea of Nietzsche's Overman or Übermensch, and then you look at the stark contrast, the diametrical contrast with Dostoevsky's Underground Man, Posts or Letters from the Underground, and you see, again, and I've implied this and stated this many times, is that is the same individual. In other words, you have somebody who is left no recourse but to completely degrade, because they are, the way that they think, the way they exist, and ultimately what they become is absolutely not supported in any way by the fabric of the ontology that they just happen to exist within. So it really implies that man is carrying the torch for this purity or this purification, and that man has failed miserably and is meant to fail miserably, but that there is a bifurcation taking place, a shedding of the skin, where the man-woman, right? So it kind of gets into from the Gnostic perspective, it gets into the Gospel of Mary a little bit, right? So Mary Magdalene. So you have Mary being assumably seen and perceived and recognized as a man now. In other words, she's taken on the 7 anti-principles and been challenged by these 7 pervading principles that you see, anti-principles that you see everywhere, where the number one thing that you are to do is to school your children and to pass down generationally this warning, this moniker that says you must impurify if you are going to survive. You must eat or you are going to be eaten, right? So we see that the Underground Man really isn't as degraded as he appears to initially look on the surface. In other words, like Nietzsche's realizations in Siberian prison, right, or not Nietzsche, but Dostoevsky's, are parallel and very similar in effect to Nietzsche's Übermensch or Overman, where we see that he was not saying that this is going to be the most, the Superman is not going to represent, I almost like to use the word supra, even though it relatively means the same thing, right? But like supra almost implies a more existential view, right? And then super seems to be a little bit more inflected, but they essentially mean the same thing. But it would be nice to see some representation there. But to say that Nietzsche's Overman isn't the most towering, warlike, Gilgamesh type providential opponent that is held in such high regard that he meets this upper tier of corporeal or temporal or carnal means, right? No, he's not voluptuous. He doesn't serve women, and in fact, he's not a part of the samsara or the ruberus at all. In fact, he is the spiritual man who is broken free from the techne, or the technology and the art, this imitation, life imitates art kind of idea, where there just is this replaying and refraction that implies this computational machine or this computational subset, right? So, and then even more so, that man could be then trapped through his own intellectualism in a right-left paradigm, where he's going the right-hand path or the left-hand path, and then he ultimately, like Manly P. Hall suggests, or is suggested in Manly P. Hall, or if he is recognized as a high-level honorary Mason, isn't that odd, right? That he would be recognizing the right-hand path. Well, there's something called the 1001 Club, where there is this, essentially, we are the tennis ball, and these good and bad ideations of government are just playing tennis with our heads, right? So I wanted to do a little something on that, and then leave way with something that, the dolphin has a clitoris. And this may seem off topic, but the clitoris is an instrument, a device, an organ that is implemented for the pleasure principle with the female, right? And other animals have clitoris, right? And humans are one of those. And you see that the G-spot, the cervix, and even more so the Skene's gland operate in such a way that create this sort of trifecta that can be really well established when you're looking at certain arcana, grimoire, and the descriptions of, all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? So again, there's this falsity that's being cast before us through this behaviorism, through the nervous system, and this rate propagation signal response that ultimately leads to either the glandular system being at odds with the neocortex, or the body systems no longer having power over said individual soul in affirmation, going through cathartic metanoia and becoming, where the corporeal, carnal, temporal world is entirely rejected. So we see, again, tying in this Nietzsche's Overman or Ubermensch with the underground man, Dostoevsky's underground man, that they are in fact the same character.